Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Engineer Your Energy. I'm Caroline Milton, owner of Milton Coaching Collective, where we help individuals and organizations develop the skills, develop the habits to become masters of their stress, to become high performing, increase their fulfillment and their productivity, and banish burnout. Each week on Thursdays, I come live across platforms to talk about those different things that we can do, whether those are individual actions we can take or organizational changes we can make in order to improve our experience of not only working, but of living. Last week, I talked about important ways of conducting end of year conversations, things to be asking if you're in a position of leadership where perhaps you're meeting with your direct reports. But on the individual contributor side of things, what are the conversation talking points that you should be bringing into those developmental conversations? You missed that episode, make sure you head back to my page and you find it. It's really chock full of not only suggestions, but also there's access to a worksheet for improving those conversations as well. Today, I want to talk about something somewhat similar, and that is the importance of good news. Now, I've talked about this on my platform before, and I'm not going to belabor the point of why it's important for us to share good news, but instead I want to focus on how we respond to good news. You know, you've been in that situation where you have something so exciting to share with someone that you care about, maybe a family member or a coworker or a friend. You're so excited, you've been waiting for days to share this good news, and you share it with them, and the reaction isn't quite encouraging. Maybe very little is said. Maybe they point out a negative implication, or maybe that good news is ignored altogether. All of those things undercut our joy. They inhibit its ability to multiply and influence our environment. So it's important for us to evaluate what are the things that we can do in order to respond to good news in a way that builds teams, that builds trust, and that builds confidence. So I want you to think, if you can, of 4 quadrants. We want to think of good news and how we respond to good news as being both active and constructive. So in our quadrants are active and passive, and then constructive and destructive. Right? So when someone is active and constructive, this is the sweet spot. That responder asks questions and additional details about the good news. They maybe perhaps ask about the underlying meaning of the event. That might sound something like, "Congratulations. I know you've been working really hard for that. Tell me a little bit about what you're excited about in this next step." On quadrant number 2, we're active, but we're destructive. So that's where we might minimize the event's significance. And it might sound a little something like, "Well, that's impressive, but don't you feel like this is just another thing that's going to stress you out?" Now, in our third quadrant, we've moved from active to passive, but we're going back to being constructive. So we're passive, but we're trying to be supportive, right? The good news is perhaps acknowledged, but there may be silence. It might sound something like, "Well, that's nice." And then in our fourth quadrant is passive and now destructive. These are the folks that tend to take attention away from the person celebrating the good news and back onto themselves. Perhaps that good news is not even acknowledged by the person that you're sharing it with. We probably know someone in our lives who tends to respond in that way. Sounds something like, "Oh, yeah, that reminds me, I need to go and talk to HR about my pay increase." Oh, okay, that's great, but I just shared with you that I received a promotion. You see how this doesn't respond well to good news. So we want to be in that first quadrant, that active, constructive quadrant, where we're asking a little more question, where we're digging in, where we're celebrating that success, because not only will that positively impact the person who is celebrating that good news, it could impact us as well. So if you're watching this today and perhaps you're like, "I don't get the big deal with good news and why it's important for us to celebrate that." First, I want to remind you that millennials and Gen Z were raised in an environment where parenting styles really focused on achievement. So, those members of your team from a very early age have been used to seeking external affirmation, validation, confirmation that they're moving in the right direction. Good news and celebrating good news is really important to these generations, and how you respond to them can be key in how you build those relationships, even if it seems a little foreign to you. So let's look at some of the roadblocks that might exist when we're talking about good news. The first might be, I'm too busy, I'm too consumed, I don't have time to sit and listen and talk about this person's good news. But you don't have to. You can just ask one more question than you think you might normally ask. Dig in a little bit more and acknowledge that you hear and understand the importance of that good news. Maybe you think, I don't care about that good news. But it's not about the news, it's about the person. It's about building that relationship and facilitating connection. Perhaps you're a little concerned about the nature of the news. You don't agree that it's so good. But, sometimes that could be the case. The general rule we want to follow here is to follow up, to celebrate that good news, and then perhaps find another time to follow up gently and dig into any concerns that you might have about the behavior or what that good news means for the individual. Maybe you think the news isn't significant enough to warrant a response. But you know what? Even celebrating the little wins can mean a big difference in a person's experience of their day. It's not your job to rank or judge the quality of someone's good news. What might be simple to you could be significant to another person. And finally, perhaps the good news sparks a little bit of jealousy in your own life. Don't worry, that's human. And don't beat yourself up about it. You do need to examine the root of why that makes you jealous, but that shouldn't take away from your ability to acknowledge the importance of that good news in someone else's life. So, with that, I'd love to hear what's some good news that you have to share. In the comments, tell us what's going well, something that you'd like a little bit of encouragement, affirmation, or celebration about. We'll chime in with some comments to acknowledge how hard you're working and how important that is. Thanks for tuning in this week for our weekly episode of Engineer Your Energy. If you'd like to learn more about both individual and organizational services that we offer, head over to miltoncc.com. That's right there on the screen for you, where you can learn a little bit more detail about those services or book a strategy session with me, where we can dig into some of your top stressors, the habits that are holding you back in terms of your fulfillment and productivity, and how we can transition into an environment of high performance. Until then,